welcome to Extraordinary People in an Ordinary World. I'm your host, Beth, and I'm an ordinary person amazed by the extraordinary people surrounding us. This podcast is about people who live among us who are doing extraordinary things. You can expect to meet people from all walks of life doing things that may inspire you, make you want to change, or just simply sit back and delight in their stories. I have met the most extraordinary people in my ordinary world, and I am so grateful to have the opportunity to share their stories. Now listen in and enjoy. Your inspiration may be right here in this episode. Today we're talking with Kate Germond, Senior Advocate and Investigator for Centurion, located in Princeton, New Jersey. Centurion was started by Jim McCluskey in 1980, and Kate has been working side by side with him since January of 1987. Their work at Centurion is dedicated to the vindication of the wrongfully accused. To date, they have freed 70 men and women who are serving a life sentence or a death sentence for crimes they did not commit. Today, I'd like to introduce one of the extraordinary people from Centurion, Kate Germond, to tell us about the first innocence organization in the world. Welcome, Kate.
Hi there.
Great to have you here today.
Yeah, this is going to be fun.
I think it will be. So this is a podcast about extraordinary people, and though you're one of many working at Centurion, your roots run very deep. So could you tell me about Centurion and how you came to work with Jim McCluskey back in 1987?
Yeah, I think as you said, we are the first innocence organization, I believe, in the world. And it was started by Jim McCluskey, who was a seminarian who part of his field ed work as a seminarian was to minister to the inmates at Trenton State Prison, which is the big state big state prison here in New Jersey. And as Jim went from tier to tier from cell to cell to cell, one inmate, a man named Chippy de los Santos, told him that he was actually innocent of the crime he was convicted of. And for Jim, that was a complete anathema. He just assumed that the criminal justice system worked perfectly and was, didn't really know what to do about this man's claim. But then every time he'd come back to his cell, because he was there every week, Jim was there every week, the guy would offer more information. And it was shocking to Jim what the man was telling him. And he was inclined to believe what he was telling Jim. And so eventually, Jim agreed to take his transcripts and police reports and the entire record of his case and read it over his Thanksgiving holiday. And he came out of it believing that Chiefy was indeed innocent. And when he came back to the tiers and to the cells and talked to Chiefy, he told him, I believe you are an innocent man in prison. And Chiefy challenged him and said, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to pray for me and keep living your life? And Jim being Jim, Jim thinks for himself. And so he dropped out of seminary for a year, worked on his case, and brought forward the main witness against Chiefy, and then ultimately hired a lawyer, Paul Castellero, who was the first lawyer on our first case, which is Chiefy's case. And then he's subsequently been the lawyer on almost all of our cases. And ultimately, Chiefy's conviction was vacated and he was freed. And Jim finished up seminary and then decided that this was what he was going to do with the rest of his life, was to work on behalf of people who were wrongly convicted. And Jim's process back then was to work on one case at a time. And in 1986, he got national attention for his third exoneration. And my husband and I had just moved back east. And I'd opened up the New York, and I was looking around for something to do while, he had been hired by a company and I was looking for something to do. And I opened up the New York Times and there was this article about this man doing this interesting work in Princeton, New Jersey. And there was a picture in the article, and Jim is sitting on what's clearly a wooden chair, holding a princess phone, and he's surrounded by clutter. And I thought, well, that man needs my help. So I called him up and we met and thought we could get along. And in January of 87, I started working with him. I started commuting from Manhattan to Princeton every day, bringing files and letters with me to read on the train both ways. And that was the beginning of us working together. And Jim is a very focused person when he works. Not that I'm not, but the good news about us is we're both dedicated to this work. But I thought about it a little more holistically in terms of we need help. So I went to the university at Princeton University and started getting student interns to come and develop cases. Once I developed systems for assessing cases, then we brought in a few Princeton University students who wanted to work on cases. And, then I at one point I decided we needed to get out of Jim's bedroom in this house where he was living and have a real office. And so we did. And that was that was another part to us, growing up, should I say. And, and now we're in these beautiful offices on Herrontown Road. I picked this place because I wanted us to never have to move again, because our work is driven by paper. And, we have, I don't want to move those file cabinets again. They're not enormous. They're heavy. It's a lot of paper. And, we just have these great offices, and we have wonderful staff, really dedicated to the work. And then we also have a group of volunteers who are, almost all of them are mature people from the community who are usually retired, and they never leave us. So we don't get much of a turnover. And here and there we get student interns, because I really like to, and Corey, our executive director, agrees, it's good to have young people in the office. They think about stuff differently. They look at things differently. And we have something to teach them, but they can also teach us. So I think we have a pretty great balance here. And by the way, just yesterday, we advocated on behalf of a man whose case we had worked on, but we weren't able to develop enough to get him exonerated. But he's such an extraordinary person that we got him paroled after 26 years. And we got to go collect him in Long Island City was where they were releasing him from. It was a Bronx case. And he had 15 family members there, which was very unusual, because, guys, when they're convicted, the prisons are far away from the cities that they, came from. They, phone calls are expensive. People, the family members are concentrating on working, and so they don't write letters. So normally when we get somebody out, yes, we get their family members to this exoneration, but they're almost strangers to each other, because they've been in for 20, 30, 40 years and with virtually no visitors except us. But this man, his name is Jose Carrion, he had like 15 family members there who all knew each other extremely well and also knew Jose. He consistently had visitors, monthly. And so it was really, it was just joyous to get him out and get him reunited with his family on the outside. And actually early next week, I'm headed down to Florida to where he's living now, to see what we can do to help him and his family, because, it's a big change for him, and it's a big change for his family also to have him in his mother's home. And, that is another of the things that we do at Centurion is, we not only take on a case, work it till we can get them exonerated. And if we can't get them exonerated, push heavily to get them paroled. And then once they're out, we go to where they are and, come alongside the family and the incarcerated person to just see what we can do to make sure that everybody thrives in this new relationship. And and I love that part. I love getting to know the family members and having them understand who we are, aside from this organization that freed the person, that they get it, that we really care about them holistically, the whole family. So get to go down to Florida, which I hate, but I love what we get to do. So it's.
I would think they're wrongfully accused, they're in prison. You said average 15 to 20 years before you're able to exonerate them?
Oh, no, 20 to 40 years now. Yeah. The criminal justice system's response to all these vacated convictions, all these freed people, it's now almost close to 4,000 people have been exonerated since 1986. The criminal justice system's response to that is, holy shit, they're getting out of prison. We have to come up with new laws. We have to push back. We can't let this happen. And I'm pretty sure your listeners don't pay as much attention to it as we do, but these conviction review units that have started, which were usually pretty earnest in the very beginning about, looking at cases like we do and vacating convictions of innocent people. Well, the courts have pushed back so hard on them, too, their fellow prosecutors, that they now basically are about, let's make a deal. What are you going to plead to? Or they'll let one of our guys go, especially if they've been in for 30 years or more, on just a nolo plea or time served. And, they're no longer exonerating people because the courts and their fellow prosecutors push back so hard. This work is really hard to do, hard to do.
Seems that I know the work that you have to do, very labor intensive. And my history with you is my daughter did a little internship there when she was deciding to be a lawyer. And my cousin Connie worked there for quite a while as a volunteer as well. And they always talk about the labor intensive work that you all do. So you're doing all that work in the background. You get them exonerated after 30 years, 20 or 30 years. I would assume that the post exoneration work is just as difficult.
Post exoneration work really, it's not so much difficult, it's another aspect to this work, because fairly early on, it occurred to me that when we because in the early days with Jim, the money that was given to us was to free people and not to spend money on clothes. And back then there were no cell phones, but that was what people gave us money for, was to work on cases and get people exonerated. And Jim, on the other hand, felt very strongly that we needed to help these people to succeed in life on the outside after they'd been in for so long. And so it's taken a while to get here where, and Jim is fully on board now, 100% on board. And God bless our new executive director. Well, she's been with us 6 years, but she understood right away when I explained to her the importance of this aspect of the work. And she's found us great funding. And it is important in order for us to expect these guys to succeed and not turn to alcohol or drugs, because the fact is they all have PTSD because of what was done to them. I mean, just imagine you're living your life, and because most of our guys have no prior criminal record, and if they have any prior criminal record, it's stupid stuff that they did as a juvenile, and then they were getting on with their life. But they still are living in like low income neighborhoods and most of our clients are Black and brown, and they're extremely vulnerable to being wrongly convicted and certainly wrongly accused. So they all have PTSD, even though when you meet them, they present as these beautiful, whole, wonderful people, which they are. But they also all have night terrors and day terrors. And, so we need to work with them and work with their families. And one of the things also in terms of working with the families when these guys first come home is everybody's poor. Nobody, because we've always said, if you can afford us, we're not going to take on your case. But so everybody's poor. So now we've put into, a low income person's house, another person to feed, more electricity, more water, more, all the, little bills that you pay when you have a home. So we want to make sure that that money doesn't become an issue between the exoneree and whoever's home they're living in, which is usually a family member, but not always. And so we try to take any sort of pressure off. And then eventually, after a number of months, we're going to start looking for a home for them to have their own home. Although sometimes guys aren't ready to move. I mean, we let them tell us when they're ready to move. But many of them are ready to try and have their own place. So, and we'll help with that too. And then we also have a retreat where all of our freed guys are invited to come to, and we'll have various therapists to talk about different modalities that they can start using at home, like deep breathing, yoga, tapping, any number of things. And then the most important part, I think, when these guys are here is they sit in a circle and they just talk to each other. And we have a psychologist who will, if they get stuck, my thing to these psychologists is, you're not to lead it. Let them lead it themselves. But if they get stuck, please, step in. But by and large, let them lead the conversation themselves, because in this group will be guys fresh out of prison, guys who've been out for several years, and guys that have been out 20 years, 30 years. So, and that they get the most out of is just talking to each other. And I think that's, we keep that up.
Is there any restitution that they get from the states where they were imprisoned ever, or what percentage of these clients do you see get anything back?
Very few get any sort of compensation. And like Florida, if you get compensation, it's some ridiculous amount of money, like $40,000, but you don't get the $40,000. You get $12,000 a year for, however many years before the 40s used up. I mean, it's, but even then, very few guys get any sort of compensation. They
Much to think
just,
about. I
the
mean,
states don't have any, or the bar is so high to climb over. They don't get any.
Yeah, the psychological,
So
financial, it's so much for them.
yeah, it's so unfair, and that's a little complicated too, because some of our guys have gotten literally millions, whereas the guys sitting around them got zero, and they were in prison for just as long. They're just as innocent, but nobody seems to hold a grudge against anybody. The have-nots do not seem to begrudge the haves their money. So, I mean, although I confess I keep an eye on it because I worry about that.
Yeah.
Because I instituted that they are a brother and a sisterhood, and their most important therapists and allies are each other. And the older, more mature guys, I give their phone numbers to the most recently released guys, so that they can call them anytime, day or night, and they'll have somebody on the end of the phone who knows exactly what they're talking about and what they're going through, and will have good suggestions, or just, I don't know what they say to each other because we don't interfere. But I think also just knowing that you can say anything to somebody and they're not going to be shocked by it is really important. And then if they need to, if they're worried about him, they can call me the older guy can tell me, you really need to check in with so-and-so. I think he needs more help with something, and I can sometimes send him to our social worker who can look for a service that would be helpful to them.
Yeah. Do you happen to have a favorite case or a case that's most memorable to you?
Wow, it's wrong to have favorites, but
memorable.
One of the men who counts himself as ours, actually we didn't exonerate. His name is James Waller. He was convicted of a sexual assault. He's Black. He was convicted of a sexual assault of a white boy. And he, I was all set to take on his case, and I had written a letter to him telling him that I was coming to Texas on a certain date, and I had permission from the warden to have a face-to-face visit with him. And then, and I had my reservations, and the next thing I know, the letter came back saying he'd been released, which blew my mind because this was a Black man convicted of raping a white boy. And while James had no prior criminal record, in fact, his alibi was he was going to classes at the University of Texas, but eyewitness identification counts for everything. And the reason James got identified was the young victim in the case was in in one of a little bodega, and James was standing in line to pay, and the kid told his mother, "That's the man who assaulted me." And James is very tall, and at that time he was wearing a big red cowboy hat, and he just kind of stands out because he's a very freakishly tall man, and usually smiling. I mean, he's just the sweetest man. So, and that caught this kid's eye, and that was the end of James's life for a lot of years. And but as I said, he got released early, and he used to call me regularly. And then at one point he called to say, "Listen, I'd like to get exonerated. Can you go back to working on that?" And so absolutely, we did. And we located the physical evidence. The only evidence left in the case was they take slides from victims of assaults of whatever cavity the ejaculate was in. Only this was anal, so there was fecal matter along with seminal fluid, so the chance of contamination was great. We had to be really careful how we got it tested, because this was back in the very early days of DNA testing. So we were in the process of negotiating with the DA for a boutique lab to do the DNA testing, so that they would be more careful with the evidence than the state crime lab would. Well, in the middle of these negotiations, word came that the state crime lab had gone ahead and tested it, and all the evidence was destroyed, and that's the end of that. And and James at that point was married, and they were holding, and the reason he'd reached out to us to get exonerated was, in Texas, they had pretty draconian laws. If you've been convicted of sexual assault of a child, you have to have a sign in the back of your car saying, this car is driven by a child molester, and one in the window of your house. And so James and his wife had held off having a child because he wouldn't have been able to go to any school programs. The kid couldn't ever have friends over at their house. So, their life would have been very strained if they had a child. So they were holding off and hoping, to get, exonerated through science. And then James continued to call me regularly, or every year around Thanksgiving. And one year he called, and I looked at the phone and saw that it was him. And it was Thanksgiving and a little after Thanksgiving, between Thanksgiving and Christmas. And it broke my heart that we couldn't get him exonerated. So I didn't answer the call, but went and listened to the message, I don't know, a week later, and James was crying. And it was like, oh my God. So I called him, and he had told me that at Thanksgiving time, his wife's family, they had gone ahead and gotten pregnant. Now, backing up just a titch, at the end of every phone call I would have with James, starting with the one where we had the failed DNA testing, he would always say, Kate, don't worry about me. God's going to make DNA. And I always thought, well, that's what it's going to take. And so he told me that he and his wife decided to get pregnant on faith, because God was going to make DNA. And so her whole family, and she got pregnant, and her whole family was coming out for Thanksgiving, and his family was coming, and they were going to celebrate her pregnancy. And she had gone to the airport to pick up her family. And when she was headed home with the family, some guy ran a red light, and she and the unborn child were killed. And that was that. And
heartbreaking.
This went on for a few, pardon me?
I said heartbreaking.
Yeah, indeed. And so for the next few years, James still called me every year around Thanksgiving, and I answered every time. And we talked a little bit, and we talked about his wife, and he's never married again. He hasn't even dated since her death. And, we would talk a little bit, and then whenever we had gatherings, James always came. And then at one point, several years later, I got a phone call from my friend Nina Morrison, who was an attorney at the Innocence Project in New York. And she told me that she had obtained the extracts from the Dallas crime lab and had them tested. And James, of course, was excluded. And James wanted her to invite me to his exoneration. Now, I knew about extracts because I'm probably one of the early people in the United States who was paying attention to what was going on in England concerning DNA testing and DNA testing in crime cases. And I knew about extracts, and what extracts are is like when a scientist is looking at the physical evidence obtained, usually seminal fluid, one of the things they do is they multiply the evidence so that, because it's usually such a minute amount, they multiply it so that that's called the extracts. And they always keep a certain amount of these extracts in reserve because all these scientists knew that DNA testing was going to get more and more and more mature, more sophisticated. They were going to be able to use smaller amounts to get even more definition. So Nina got, and thank goodness I didn't remember the extracts because I was so devastated at the time that the evidence had been destroyed. It just went out of my head. But that's good, because if I'd tested the extracts back then, they would have been destroyed, and that would have been the end of any physical evidence to get him exonerated. So my stupidity and heartbreak served us well in this time. And so I went to James's exoneration, and afterwards Centurion paid for a dinner for everybody involved in the case. And somebody took a picture of James and I sitting next to each other. And I have a picture here in my office. And one time I had asked James to and Texas has one of the best compensation, along with New York's compensation statutes. And so he got a number of millions for his years as wrongly convicted. And he bought a house in Louisiana. He calls it a plantation, and he plants pecan trees for every Dallas exoneree. And he has them over for a big, whatever, barbecue every summer. But I said, James, describe to me your house. So I'm going to pull up in front of your house, and I'm going to knock on the door. And what does your house look like? And he said, well, Kate, when you come into the entranceway, the very first thing you're going to see is the picture of you and me that was taken at the luncheon to celebrate my exoneration. I mean, and James is one of those guys that he comes to everything we do, and he celebrates all the Texas exonerees too. But he's the one, when he's here, if somebody, one of the exonerees says, hey, after whatever, let's go to a bar and, have some cocktails. James will grab the car keys. He'll drive. He doesn't drink, and he doesn't do drugs. And he drinks a ridiculous amount of coffee. And, but with no judgment, he just hangs with everybody. And if things, at some point, he will know it's time to gather everybody up and send them back to the hotel, and everybody climb into bed because tomorrow we're doing, whatever it is. I mean, he's just this remarkable, steady, deep person. I have a wonderful picture of him on my wall or in my window. I have like giant pictures in front of my big windows of me with him. I mean, I'm so fond of him, and everybody is. You meet James Waller and you just fall in love.
Well, so yeah, like James sees that you're an extraordinary person also.
Yeah.
I know you don't see this, Kate, but you are.
I don't know.
Person, both you and Jim Klosky, right?
Yeah. Jim, me, the thing about me doing this work anybody could see it from 100 yards that I'm going to do this work. I mean, I've marched for civil rights. I marched against the Vietnam War. I stopped small net fishing and clear cut logging when I lived in Mendocino. I mean, I've been an activist my whole life and very cynical about the criminal justice system. Jim, on the other hand, went to Vietnam and had a good time, and it was very straight and very Republican, and it just assumed the criminal justice system worked, which is why Chiefy telling him that he was wrongly convicted was like, Jim's head exploded once he believed that it was true. And then once he started working on Chiefy's case, Chiefy told him about several other New Jersey inmates who he knew were innocent. Innocent people in prison meet other innocent people. It's interesting. They don't have a lot of friends through their long incarcerations, but they do have a few good friends, and almost all of them were wrongly convicted. And so Jim doing this work is a surprise, especially to his Bucknell buddies and, the guys he was in the service with. But nobody's surprised that I do this work. I feel like, and now we all do. We all feel we're incredibly lucky that we get to serve these people.
Well, I think also they're lucky to have you. I mean, not everybody can do it. And I'm sure the work is not easy. It can get frustrating.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, this work is not for the faint of heart. I mean, we have a couple of cases right now where the prosecutor's office that prosecuted the case that we are advocating for agrees that the conviction should be vacated based on all the evidence we brought forward. But the Attorney General of the state is saying, no, you cannot let them go. They have to stay in prison. I mean, this work is hard. And as I said at the beginning of this, the criminal justice system's response to all these people being exonerated is, we have to stop this. We can't let them out.
Yeah. Yeah,
what the hell?
That seems a little crazy to me.
It seems dead wrong to me. I mean, prosecutors, defense lawyers don't take this, or public defenders. They don't have an oath they take. Prosecutors have an oath, and their oath says they are to do justice, not just pursue a conviction. They are to do justice. Hello?
That makes sense, right? So with all of the cases that you currently have, which are about 100 ongoing, 21 active cases, how do you keep people motivated to keep doing the work, and yourself? How do you keep motivated as well? Is it mostly volunteers that you have there?
Yeah. Yes, we have a number of highly motivated volunteers who've been with us for years, who come in and they give us, I think, at least 10 hours a week. I've lost track because I'm not involved in that much anymore, other than saying hello to them. But they're the ones who develop the cases. And they're incredibly important. They're extremely devoted to the work. They care. And in fact, one of our volunteers, and they come from these really varied backgrounds. We've had landscape architects and veterinarians and scientists in fields that have nothing to do with our work. But and in fact, one of these scientists belongs to a quilting guild. And at one point, she was telling her fellow quilters what she did with us, developing cases. And the quilters said, well, what if we made a quilt for these people when they get out of prison? Which, wow, what a great idea. And every time we've delivered a quilt to these guys, they get tears in their eyes because, I realized it's home, it's comfort, and it's something somebody built just for them. No two look alike. It's the coolest darn thing that these people do. And all they ask is that the guys take a picture of themselves with the quilt. And I will confess that most of them don't do it. I don't know why, they just don't. And but the ones that do, they all do differently. Some of them lay on the quilt, some of them wrap themselves in it, but all of them, if I get to be there when I hand it off, I mean, they have tears in their eyes because it's I think because it's home, somebody built it for them. I mean, it's such a precious thing. But we do also have student volunteers here and there, because Corey agrees with me that it's really important that we have young people in this office, because I'm the oldest by a lot. But, everybody else they're all mature. They're in their 50s and 60s. And, so we need young people in the office to, well, if nothing else, they understand technical stuff and can get us out of the little messes we get ourselves into on the computer or the copier. So, it's a practical consideration as well. But they do the heavy lifting, and while the attorneys especially, get knocked back and discouraged when they put all this, the investigators put all this effort in, brought in all this good evidence of this person's innocence. And then the lawyers put it into a legal petition to get the conviction vacated, and then we get denied, and it's soul crushing for everybody, but most especially the incarcerated people, who are always so gracious to us as we're apologizing for, or we're explaining to them, we're not going anywhere. We're going to hang in there with you. We're going to keep going. We're going to file another petition, based on something else. The lawyers, all lawyers, but they're always so gracious, to us, I guess, because our voices are, and if we're facing them, we have tears in our eyes because we're so crushed that we were so hopeful that the courts would respond positively, and then we get knocked back, but they're the ones who are so gracious to us, and they're holding us up, saying it's going to be okay. I know you're going to file another petition. I know you're going to stick with me. And we do. I mean, we send them books. We try to keep them occupied. But, this work is hard. It's hard. It's hard.
I think I had heard that, Jim McCloskey, the original founder, he has a book, correct?
Oh, yes. Jim wrote a book called When Truth Is All You Have. Great title. When Truth Is All You Have. And what it is it's about Jim's life. And ultimately about him finding this work and working on cases and that. But it's a very honest, R-rated, not X, but R-rated book. It's not for children, about, what his life was, and then, I mean, Jim wound up in seminary because he'd been making a lot of money working for a consulting group out of Philadelphia, and he began to feel there had to be more to life than just making money, and he started going to a church, and the pastor there eventually said, you should just go to seminary and see if you don't get some answers there. And Jim just assumed he'd probably pastor a church, but that would have been a disaster. But instead, he responded to Chiefy and founded this work. And so this is his story about founding Centurion. Now, you should also know that John Grisham has long been an admirer of Jim and what he's done with us. And he's now, he's asked Jim to write a book with him. They're each featuring 5 cases of wrongful convictions in a book entitled Framed. And that's going to drop in, I think, August of this year. And so Jim's been busily working on that with John, which is kind of cool.
That's really cool. That's really cool.
Yeah.
You're a 501(c), right? 501(c)(3),
Yes.
and everything that you do, you don't ask for any money from any of the prisoners, their families. If somebody wanted to help, do you have fundraisers, or is it more just here's some money and do what you need?
Yeah, we have one celebration a year, usually in September. This year, September 21st, at the New York Public Library. That's our big fundraiser. And, but we have quite a few people who give us money, either a generous amount every year, or we have people who give us, money every month. And, and then John Grisham wrote a book called The Guardians, and it's a fictitious book about Centurion. Centurion is the Guardians, are the Guardians. And John in the foreword mentions us, and in the afterword mentions us, and says, if you have any change laying around, do send it to this organization. They rely on donations. And that book dropped just when the pandemic dropped, which is when Jim's book dropped. And so his speaking tour, all the speaking engagements he had to be canceled. And so John's book really helped us through the pandemic because people responded to it very generously and sent us money. And in fact, we still get money, little, they're usually pretty small checks, but we're appreciative of, little $10, $15, $20 checks from the book, The Guardians. And it's a fun read. I always tell people it's completely fictitious. The only thing that's accurate about us and his characters is that we are frugal and we are tenacious, but we don't steal evidence to get it tested. We're pretty straight and narrow about how we conduct ourselves, but we are very tenacious and we are very frugal.
That's great. So donations, and they can be sent to where?
You would send them to Centurion, Centurion, and then the address is 1000 Herrontown Road, Princeton, New Jersey, 08540. You can always go to our website, which is just centurion.org. And all that information is there as well. And you get the stories of the people we've worked on behalf of. And we're working on getting, stories out about the guys that we're currently working on behalf of. Once we file their petition, because we like to fly under the radar until we're ready to file something, as opposed to alerting the prosecutor that we're trying to get evidence to vacate a conviction that they are clinging to tenaciously.
Well, I want to thank you for today. You are one of the many extraordinary people there at Centurion, but as one of the co-founders with
Indeed.
Jim McCloskey, um, you're definitely a perfect guest for my podcast here, Extraordinary People in an Ordinary World. And I am so pleased to have met you and learned all about the goings on there. It's so much more intricate than just exonerating people. It's that whole post-exoneration. So I want to thank you, and I want to thank everyone that works there at Centurion. And
Um,
we get lots of donations and lots of book purchases after this as well.
well, thank you so much. And yeah, and if you're ever in the neighborhood, you should drop by because we're pretty cool. Especially my office.
Oh, I've heard. My daughter and my cousin Connie tell me all the time, you just have to go there. You just cannot believe it.
Yeah, you get to meet people and yeah. But I am proud of us and I you know, I love what we get to do. And I love everybody who has chosen to work here and give us their time. It's amazing.
Well, again, Kate, I
'Cause
want to
it's hard.
thank you. It's really, truly been a pleasure.
Likewise.
Thank you for joining me on Extraordinary People in an Ordinary World. I hope you enjoyed today's show. Please share with a friend. If you know an extraordinary person, I would love to hear from you so that I can feature them on the show. Please email me at bethextraordinarypeople@gmail.com, or you can message me on Instagram at extraordinary_people_podcast. I look forward to hearing from you. And in the words of Saint Mother Teresa, not all of us can do great things, but we can all do small things with great love. I look forward to our next extraordinary person, the first Friday of next month. See you then.